She is the most famous woman from ancient history, a living goddess who captured the hearts of two of Rome's greatest generals and oversaw a golden age for her kingdom.
It's a great story of a great individual, undoubtedly. It's also absolutely pivotal in the history of Egypt and in the history of the ancient world.
From Caesar to Shakespeare to modern cinema, her story has remained as popular as ever. Her name despised, idolized, and mythologized. Cleopatra.
She is able to control her own destiny. This is a woman who is not stupid. Yes, there might be love in there as well, but it's a story of a great politician.
Cleopatra rests among antiquity's most daring queens. But how did she rise to such a prominent position, reviving the fortunes of her floundering Hellenistic kingdom? How did she rise to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean?
People always look at Cleopatra. One of the questions that everybody asks is, where does reality stop? Where does the history stop and the fiction start?
Cleopatra's story is one of the best and most important we have from ancient history.
This is the rise of Cleopatra.
This government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
Whether Russia has been provoked. What matters is that Russia has been wrong in its response.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation. Terror beseitigt verwahren wir das Land.
Cleopatra was born in around 69 BC. She was born into a dynasty that had ruled over Egypt for more than 200 years.
Ptolemaic dynasty is the name that we give to the kings who basically are all descended from each other and call themselves Ptolemy. It's right at the end of Egypt's dynastic age, so it's right at the end of the period where Egypt is ruled by pharaohs or kings, and it's after Alexander the Great has conquered Egypt. So conquers Egypt in 332 BCE. He dies shortly after, and one of his generals, Ptolemy, takes the throne.
Ptolemy took Egypt, founded a new line, and from there you get 2 or 3 centuries worth of rulers descended from Ptolemy, a great number of whom have the same name, Ptolemy. So Ptolemy the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, through to the 14th, hence the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Ptolemaic period.
By the 1st century BC, however, this once dominant kingdom found itself dwarfed by the new hegemonic power in the Mediterranean, Rome.
Rome is getting stronger. It's working towards being sort of imperial Rome that we recognise from the Emperor Augustus. So we have Julius Caesar coming to prominence. So Rome is increasingly becoming a force to be reckoned with. And the Egyptians are unfortunately indebted to Rome.
Rome had been called upon from time to time by Egypt to help out with various issues. The reason Rome would be happy to help out in Egypt's affairs is because Egypt was a very, very wealthy place, and Rome relied on resource from Egypt flowing back to Rome. So if there was an issue that might have prohibited materials from reaching Rome, Rome would take an interest. So for quite some time, Rome had been called on by Egypt, which meant that Rome weren't going to do this for free. It meant that Egypt was increasingly in Rome's debt.
And in fact, by the time of Cleopatra's birth, Egypt was really a client state, highly dependent on Rome and subject to its will.
At the heart of Cleopatra's world was a city, a wealthy metropolis that at the time was a shining light of the Mediterranean, Alexandria.
We're very fortunate when it comes to Alexandria that we have some quite detailed descriptions of what it was like.
Obviously, it's an Egyptian city, it's in Egypt, but it's not like any other Egyptian city. First of all, it's really new. It's founded by Alexander the Great, but basically built by the Ptolemies. This is a new city with bright new buildings. It's got a library, it's got the university and museum, it's got a lighthouse. It's a Mediterranean city.
It's very Greek, overridingly Greek in terms of architecture and other things. In fact, the architecture at this particular time wouldn't have looked that ancient Egyptian. So you travel further down in the Nile Valley, you've got very ancient Egyptian looking temples and buildings and things. In Alexandria, much more Greek influence at this particular time.
It's so strange that the Egyptians themselves call it Alexandria next to Egypt. They don't just call it Alexandria because to the native Egyptians who don't live in Alexandria, they regard it as very, very strange.
It's quite a diverse place. There are three main population groups there. We've got Egyptians, obviously. We've got Greeks, obviously, as well. And also quite a sizable Jewish cohort too. And that's putting things quite neatly into separate cohorts. The diversity would have been greater than that, of course. Nubians, people from Sudan, would have been part of Egyptian society for some time and clearly would be in Alexandria as well.
And they appear to have been allowed to live harmoniously alongside one another. And that undoubtedly, I think, probably contributed to Alexandria's success culturally and intellectually. It was a very international, one is tempted to say almost kind of modern, international city.
Cleopatra belonged to no ordinary Alexandrian family. She was royalty.
Cleopatra has, I think it's fair to say, the great misfortune to be born into a bit of a nightmare of a family.
Well, Cleopatra's a Ptolemy, and the Ptolemies have been on the throne for about 300 years. They're a family that has the tradition of brother-sister marriages, so they're quite a close family, if you like. But this has not necessarily been a good thing. It means that they're a family that's got a lot of infighting, as people jostle for the throne, as people are quite happy to bump off their relations to get to the throne. Her immediate family, though, is quite complicated and interesting. Her father is Ptolemy XII, but he wasn't born to be king of Egypt. He was an illegitimate son, and he was called in as king because the infighting that had gone ahead had basically wiped out most of the royal family. So he was the only one left to take the throne. Even though he was illegitimate and living in Syria, he was brought to Egypt and made king of Egypt. So he'd never expected this. He is married to a woman called Cleopatra. You find that they use the same names over and over again. Cleopatra V, we call her, but we don't know who she was. Now, we could guess that maybe she was his sister because they did go in quite a lot for brother-sister marriages, but not necessarily. And we can't just say because she was called Cleopatra that she was a member of that family, because she might have changed the name when she married. So we don't know who her mother was. Regardless,
she was the eldest child of Ptolemy XII and his wife or wives, and she had a couple of younger brothers as well, who go on to be Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. So that's essentially Cleopatra's kind of core immediate family unit as far as we know it. It's tough with Cleopatra's early years, there's nothing really recorded. That said, we can look at the context in which she grew up. So we can acknowledge that she's growing up in Alexandria, that it's this fantastic place of learning, and we can look at some fantastic scholarship done by medieval Arab scholars. And the sources that they've interrogated, when we look at their work, suggest strongly that Cleopatra was highly literate. She spoke different languages, which would make sense for a statesperson, especially living and working in that part of the world with huge diversity. So I think we can start piecing together the picture of a young Cleopatra as a scholar. And I don't think there's much of a problem with that. I think that the activities she goes on to do shows that she's clearly a learned person. So that's what we know of Cleopatra's early life in a nutshell, that she seems to have really taken advantage of the Greek tuition that were available to her as a royal member of the family.
Things would take a turn for the worse, however, not long after Cleopatra's 10th birthday.
Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's dad, is forced into exile, and it comes back to Rome's influence in Egypt at this particular time.
But Ptolemy XII wasn't particularly popular, and he'd borrowed money from the Romans, so he was struggling a bit anyway. He wasn't popular with the people of Alexandria. What mattered in those days is what the people of Alexandria thought. The people outside Egypt, less so. And then the Romans decided to take over Cyprus, which was actually being ruled by his brother, and it all ended very tragically for the brother.
Rome taking over Cyprus leads Ptolemy XII's brother to commit suicide. The real problem is Ptolemy XII doesn't do anything. You get the impression he kind of shrugs his shoulders and, yeah, oh well. And the Alexandrians find that abhorrent. They're like, this is no ruler, that's his own blood, no chance. And so they send him packing and he flees off to Rhodes.
Such an act must have had repercussions for the young Cleopatra.
Cleopatra at this time it looks like she's already proved herself a good ally of her father, a potential ruler, someone who's smart, someone who's well trained. Some people believe that she went off with her father, Ptolemy XII.
She seems to have a genius for keeping a low profile at times of crisis, which I think is a very, very sensible thing to do. So there are really key moments in her history where you wonder what she's doing, you hear nothing, and she seems to have this ability to wait and see which way things turn out, and then to work out accordingly how to align herself. And I suspect she wouldn't have been very old at this time, so maybe she was just too young to have any say in it. But I suspect also that deliberate low-key is what she's playing.
Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy, was ultimately reinstated thanks to Rome, an important moment that also affected the young Cleopatra.
It's at this time when Ptolemy XII gets his throne back that we start to see Cleopatra more clearly. She starts to associate herself with him. Her mother, Cleopatra V, or her potential mother, we're not quite sure, has vanished. Her elder sister has been executed, and her other sister is a younger sister. And one thing we know that kings of Egypt need is a queen to support them. They don't actually have to be necessarily married to that queen. I'm not suggesting that she marries her father, but she seems to have supported him by performing feminine role alongside his kingship.
Having restored his control over Egypt, Ptolemy continued to rule the country until his death in 51 BC. A seismic moment for the teenage Cleopatra.
Now, through this kind of period, Cleopatra's clearly proved herself to her father as a capable individual. And so in his will, he signals that Cleopatra the seventh, his daughter, should rule alongside her younger brother, so the eldest of her two younger brothers, and that's Ptolemy XIII. So now we've got the situation where Ptolemy XII is dead, and his daughter, Cleopatra VII, she's around 20 years old, 18, 19 years old, and her eldest younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, is around 10 or 11. They're co-ruling together. Effectively,
she is in charge because he's just too young. So although they are king and queen together, as soon as they come to the throne together, we see her name goes forward, and he's sort of pushed out of the limelight, if you like, and it's as if she's ruling alone. And he's there, young, and being supported by a group of tutors, but not really able to fight against it because he's just too young really to do anything at this time. But obviously we can guess that he's not particularly happy about this situation. It's not the normal way. Normally the king's name would always go first, and in this instance, the king isn't even mentioned.
Fortunately for Cleopatra, she had several precedents for powerful Ptolemaic queens.
Cleopatra II, Cleopatra III, along with a lot of these earlier Ptolemaic rulers, Arsinoe II as well is another really big one. They serve as a really nice model for Cleopatra because these people ruled Egypt as queens of Egypt. They were very powerful, they were well respected, their images were put on temple walls. They were legitimate pharaohs of Egypt or queens of Egypt alongside pharaohs at various times. And so Cleopatra finds herself in a very similar position to that as a woman who is rather taking the lead in the rulership of Egypt. And so to a certain extent, she's looking back to these ancestors and kind of moulding herself in the same way. They provide a nice model for someone like Cleopatra.
From the limited evidence that survives, it seems that Cleopatra aims to follow in the footsteps of her regnal predecessors right from the start of her reign.
We know from a stela that was discovered at Armant, a site a few kilometres to the south of the ancient city of Thebes, where the cult of the Egyptians' favourite god for most of ancient Egyptian history, Ammon, was to be found. Cleopatra was present, we know from this stela, at the installation of a Bukis bull. This was an important part of the religious landscape in Egypt, and she, according to the stela, was not just present, but herself rowed the boat that the bull was taken to Armand on. Difficult to know whether this reflects a genuine historical event in the early life of Cleopatra as a newly installed pharaoh, or whether she herself is manipulating things already here. She was probably aware that in doing this and having it recorded in this way, she would be seen to be playing a major part in something that for the Egyptians themselves would have held very dear. It's difficult, I think, not to imagine that already she had one eye on trying to make sure that she had the approval of the Egyptian people. And that's a theme that runs right the way through her reign.
For 2 to 3 years, Cleopatra was essentially Egypt's sole ruler. Her prominence, however, did not last.
It seems almost inevitable that, having been installed as joint rulers of Egypt, Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII would fall out.
Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII fall out because they both want to rule Egypt. So she has been ruling Egypt effectively, and he's just been a silent partner. Now he's old enough, he wants to take over, and he doesn't particularly want to be doing it with his big bossy elder sister there. So he starts to push himself forward, and he is supported by a group of tutors and advisors. She presumably has a group of tutors and advisors with her, but we learn more about his because he's younger, and they're pushing him, telling him what to do all the time.
The impression you get through this is that Ptolemy XIII's court is becoming kind of more and more unhappy, and at the same time Cleopatra is potentially becoming a little more and more unpopular, certainly amongst her brother's groupings. And so that all comes to a head at one particular point, and backed with his court, Ptolemy XIII kind of makes these issues known and starts to try and do the opposite and push Cleopatra out.
Ptolemy's coup against Cleopatra worked. Seeing that popular support was on her brother's side, Cleopatra and her supporters fled Alexandria. The queen, however, was intent on regaining her throne.
So as with the pattern in the Ptolemaic period of people being exiled, Cleopatra finds herself having to flee Egypt because of her younger brother's intensive activity towards her. He's not happy, of course. So she flees and she heads to Syria, and Ptolemy XIII rules alone in Egypt as the sole ruler. What's quite incredible is that somehow, and we're not quite sure how, Cleopatra manages to raise quite a substantial army in Syria. She has designs on coming back to Egypt, of course. But it's not as straightforward as her simply sailing back to Egypt and taking the throne, because something else is happening in the background with Rome. We've got this kind of civil war between Pompey and Caesar, these two generals, and these Roman generals are hugely powerful. They command massive, massive armies.
By August 48 BC, Julius Caesar was winning the Roman civil war against Pompey, having recently defeated his great rival at the climactic Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey, however, survived the battle and vowed to fight on, intent on reviving his fortunes in Egypt. It was a decision that would greatly affect both Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.